Pregnant bobcat begs for rescue at door, and what followed became a life-changing bond. Elias Whitaker sat in his old armchair, eyes fixed on the foggy wooden door where ash from recent small wildfires still blanketed the gutters and porch roof of the cabin in a thin white layer. Evacuation alerts had echoed throughout the Santa Monica Mountains' dry winds. Scorched pines, tiny flames crawling across the hillsides. Local authorities had ordered every household in the area to leave for safety, but Elias had decided to stay. This cabin, with every timber and plank, had been the home he shared with Clara, his wife, for 40 years. Leaving felt like abandoning Clara all over again, like admitting that the life they'd built together could simply be erased by flame and ash. Though now alone, he wanted to hold on to this place as if preserving a piece of memory, a piece of heart not yet faded. Clara had planted wildflowers along the stone path leading to the front door, flowers that bloomed every spring in bursts of purple and yellow. When she passed 2 years ago, the flowers stopped blooming, as if the earth itself had decided to mourn with him. Pumpkin, the chubby orange tabby Clara had once adored, stirred by the fireplace, as if understanding his heart. One night, while the forest wind howled and heavy rain pounded the tin roof like war drums in a storm, Elias sat by his old radio tuning for wildfire updates. Suddenly, amid the wind and thunder, came an unusual screech, long, dry, like a cry for help from deep in the ancient woods. Pumpkin jolted, fur standing on end. Elias felt his heart pound a primal instinct he had never known before. Outside on the porch, trees bent low, dead leaves scattering wildly, and with a flash of lightning, just enough light for him to see the trembling figure on the doorstep. Sierra, a female bobcat, lay collapsed, her fur matted with smoke and ash, her flank swollen from a claw wound, eyes wild with panic. Breathing shallow, rain lashed her gaunt chest, each drop mixing with old dried blood. Without hesitation, Elias bent to lift Sierra. Pumpkin shrank behind him, eyes wide in the night, in his arms. Sierra trembled but did not resist, as if she understood he posed no threat. He brought her into the cabin, wrapped Clara's wool blanket around her body, placed a bowl of water nearby, then sat silently watching the quivering shadow by the hearth. Outside, the storm raged, branches scraping the roof, rain hammering the windows. But inside, the cabin glowed with warmth, firelight dancing across the wooden walls, settling into the corners where Clara's presence still lingered in the arrangement of books, the folded quilts, the row of mason jars she'd never labeled. By morning, the sky cleared, but the air still smelled of smoke. Dry gusts blew gently, stirring the acrid scent of charred forest. Elias cleaned the blood, examined her injuries, a deep claw gash along her side, light burns on both hind legs from nearby flames. Carefully, he tore strips from Clara's old woolen blanket, the one she used when winter snow covered the hills, and wrapped them gently around her wounds. Sierra whimpered softly, eyes narrowing, but she didn't flinch. Pumpkin sat by the foot of the chair, his gaze steady as if awaiting a miracle. In the days that followed, Pumpkin stood nightly guard at the door, reacting to every rustle in the cabin, each creak under the wind. He had become a silent sentinel. Pumpkin nudged his food bowl closer to Sierra's blanket, then settled beside her with deliberate care. When thunder crashed outside, Sierra's ears flattened against her skull, but Pumpkin pressed his warm flank against her trembling side. His purr, a steady rumble that seemed to say, "You're safe here." One night, under a calm scout ash drifting down like dusty snow, Elias sat at the old wooden table, holding a book Clara had once loved. It was a collection of Native American folklore tales of the western bobcat, a sacred creature, said to appear in wild mountain regions, bearing both curse and blessing for the lonely and kind-hearted. Clara had adored that book. He ran his finger along a passage Clara had underlined in pencil, her handwriting in the margin, "Remember this, Eli." The words read, "When your heart gives with sincerity, nature sometimes returns something far greater than what you offered. Those who rescue a bobcat in distress may be rewarded with a second family." Elias sat very still, the book open in his lap. Now, watching Sierra's chest rise and fall in peaceful sleep, Pumpkin curled protectively at her side, He wondered if Clara had known something he hadn't. Perhaps she had always understood that grief could be transformed, that emptiness could be filled in the most unexpected ways. Sierra slowly recovered. Each day brought small victories, a few steps across the cabin floor, a drink of water taken without trembling, eyes that no longer held quite so much wildness. Then one morning, while Pumpkin was sniffing curiously around her resting spot, he suddenly let out a faint meow. Elias, puzzled, approached and saw her belly slightly swollen, a sign she was pregnant. His eyes welled up. He promised himself he would help bring her babies into this world, as if nurturing new life would also be a new beginning for himself. Elias prepared a nesting area in the corner near the fireplace, using Clara's quilts and old sweaters to create a soft, warm bed. He researched bobcat pregnancies in every sources in town, learning what signs to watch for, what complications might arise. He picked up his camera and began capturing every moment between the two cats, Sierra lying sideways on the wool blanket, Pumpkin standing guard, Sierra's belly growing, her breathing more labored, Pumpkin circling her gently, as if offering encouragement, or the time Pumpkin nudged a biscuit toward her nose when she was too tired to get up. Through the lens, Elias tried to freeze these fleeting moments. This is life. He filled albums with photographs, writing small captions beneath each one. Day 15, Sierra takes her first full meal. Day 23, Pumpkin teaches Sierra to play with the yarn ball. Day 31, Sierra's belly is unmistakable now. Elias lifted Clara's old cannon, its familiar weight settling into his arthritic hands. Through the viewfinder, Sierra's spotted coat filled the frame, and for the first time in months, his mind went quiet. No memories of hospital rooms, no echo of Clara's labored breathing, just the soft click of the shutter capturing this moment of peace. The ash-covered cabin had become the unlikely home of a strange family amidst the ruins of a burned forest where an old man, a lazy house cat, and a wild bobcat were trying to survive, to love, and to believe in hope. Neighbors who had returned after the evacuation was lifted would sometimes drive past and see Elias on the porch, Sierra resting at his feet, Pumpkin sprawled across his lap. Word spread through the small mountain community old Elias Whitaker had lost his mind and taken in a wild animal. But those who knew him better understood he hadn't lost his mind. He'd found his heart again. Then came the night, the destined night. Mountain winds howled through the cracks in the door, branches scraping the wooden roof with an eerie rhythm. Sierra moaned repeatedly, breath short and broken. Elias gathered warm towels, fresh water, and pulled the oil lamp closer to the birthing spot. Pumpkin sat at the edge, his body trembling, but his wide eyes alert, as if he understood that this moment mattered more than any nap or play. Sierra was wild, unpredictable, and the kittens were so much smaller, more fragile than any creature he'd seen in the world before. His hands shook from age, from fear, from the weight of responsibility, but he steadied himself with deep breaths and Clara's voice in his memory. Steady now, Eli. Life knows what it's doing. You just have to help it along. The first bobcat kitten arrived easily small, wet but strong. Sierra licked it clean with fierce maternal determination. And within minutes, the tiny creature was mewing and crawling toward warmth. The second followed, then the third. Each time, Elias felt his chest tighten with wonder and relief. But the fourth, Sierra screamed in pain, her body straining without success. Elias bent over, heart racing, hands trembling from age and fear of causing harm. He found a tiny paw trapped, gently maneuvered the twisted body. Sierra didn't claw him, didn't snarl. She only looked into his eyes, those golden, damp eyes filled with pain, but absolute trust. In that moment, Elias understood what Clara had meant about nature giving back. This wild creature, who by all rights should have fled or attacked, was trusting him with the most precious thing in her world. The weight of that trust was almost unbearable. Pumpkin suddenly leaned in, licking Sierra's head repeatedly. Then the kitten's face as if urging Elias to hurry. In that brief second, Elias understood they were doing this together. Not just him and Sierra, but all three of them, a team bound not by blood or species, but by something deeper, something ancient and true. With one final push, Sierra managed to deliver the trapped kitten into Elias's hands smaller, weaker, its back legs bent oddly. It didn't cry, didn't move. Elias breathed warm air over it, rubbing its fragile body with a towel, his heart hammering in his chest. This couldn't be how it ended, not after everything. Pumpkin kept licking its neck, firmly and persistently, his rough tongue working with determined purpose. One breath, then a soft, clear mule. Elias broke into tears, great, heaving sobs that shook his shoulders and blurred his vision. Sierra nudged her head against his forehead, then gently licked the weakest kitten, welcoming it back to life. In that touch, that gentle press of wild head to human brow, Elias felt something break open inside him. The last hard shell of grief that had been protecting his heart finally cracked and fell away. That little one, the fourth, born in hardship and with a disability, would one day become hollow. But in that moment, as Elias held the tiny life in his palm and felt its first struggling breaths, he knew only gratitude and wonder. In the days following the birth of the Bobcat kittens, the Santa Monica Mountains seemed more alive than Elias had ever known. The rain cleared, sunlight broke through the trees, and beams of light danced across the cabin, turning what had once felt like a cold shelter into a tiny fairyland for the four little bobcats. They chased each other around the fireplace, bit Pumpkin's tail, climbed on Elias's back as if scaling a small hill. Hollow, despite his weak legs, still tried to keep up. Every time he fell, Pumpkin gently nudged him back up with his head, and when Pumpkin was tired, Elias would lift Hollow in his arms, massaging his little legs, patiently teaching him how to walk one step at a time. The cabin now echoed with the sounds of kittens and laughter, a sound Elias thought he had lost forever since Clara's passing. He would catch himself smiling at nothing, chuckling when one kitten, the boldest, whom he'd started calling Scout, would launch himself at imaginary prey, landing in a tumble of fur and limbs. Another, a delicate female with Sierra's exact markings around her eyes, preferred to observe from higher ground, perched on the back of the sofa. Elias named her Whisper for the soft, chirping sounds she made. The third, stocky and playful, spent most of his time wrestling with Pumpkin, who tolerated the attacks with surprising patience. That one became bolder. And then there was Hollow, always a beat behind, always trying harder, always falling and getting back up. Elias found himself drawn most to this smallest one, perhaps because he recognized something in the kitten's struggle, the determination to keep going even when the body wouldn't cooperate, even when every instinct said to give up. He had felt that way after Clara died, when getting out of bed seemed impossible, when breathing itself felt like a betrayal of the grief he carried. Elias's granddaughter, Nora, visited soon after hearing he was raising a whole family of bobcats. She'd driven up from Los Angeles with a mixture of concern and curiosity, certain she would find her grandpa in some state of crisis. When she stepped onto the porch, she carried a box of supplies, canned food, batteries, a new first aid kit, practical things that showed she cared even if she worried about his choices. She laughed at the sight of four kittens crowding around Elias's pant leg, their tiny spotted bodies tumbling over each other in their eagerness to investigate this new human. But when she saw Hollow learning to walk, dragging his back legs slightly as he pushed forward with fierce concentration, she grew quiet. She knelt beside him, watching as he stumbled, caught himself, stumbled again. When he finally made it across the room to where Pumpkin lay, collapsing against the orange cat's warm belly in exhausted triumph, Nora looked up at her grandpa with tears streaming down her face. "You're saving their souls, Grandpa," she whispered. A law student in her internship, Nora quickly helped Elias create identification cards for each kitten, photos, names, birth dates, personalities, all laminated with care. Signed below, Guardian Elias Whitaker. She spent hours photographing each kitten, noting their unique markings and behaviors. The winter came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a ferocity that caught even the weathered locals by surprise. Snow dusted the cabin roof, and frost patterns spread across the windows like delicate lace. Elias brought out Clara's old sweaters from the cedar chest at the foot of his bed, soft wool in shades of cream and forest green, smelling faintly of lavender and memory. He cut and stitched pieces together, his arthritic fingers moving slowly but deliberately, making tiny coats for each bobcat. His fingers, stiff with arthritis, struggled with the needle, but he persisted. Clara had taught him to sew years ago, insisting that any man who lived in the mountains should know how to mend his own clothes. Now those lessons became a gift he could give to these new lives. When all four lay in a row before the fireplace, wrapped in sweaters of green and blue and red and yellow, Nora softly cried, "They look like kids getting ready for school." She took photo after photo, her phone clicking as she captured the absurdity and beauty of the scene. Scout kept trying to wriggle free of his sweater, twisting and flopping like a fish out of water. Whisper sat perfectly still, as if she understood the dignity required for a portrait. Boulder fell asleep almost immediately, snoring softly. And Hollow, nestled against Pumpkin, looked up at Elias with eyes that seemed far too wise for such a small creature. The photograph she took that day would become Elias's favorite four bobcat kittens in sweaters. Pumpkin sprawled majestically in the center like a benevolent king, and Sierra in the background, watching with what could only be described as maternal amusement. It captured everything: the absurdity, the love, the impossible family that grief and chance had built. Sierra had grown restless in recent days, pacing the perimeter of the cabin at dawn and dusk, pausing at the door to sniff the air. Elias noticed but said nothing. He knew what was coming, even if he didn't want to acknowledge it. Then one morning, she disappeared. No warning, no sound. Elias woke up to find the kittens snuggled together, already eating, playing, and sleeping without their mother. Pumpkin sat by the door, staring into the distance, as if he'd understood everything before his human had. The realization struck Elias hard, even though he knew Sierra belonged to the wild. It felt like losing something precious all over again. He spent that day in a daze, checking every corner of the cabin, calling softly at the door, scanning the tree line for any sign of her distinctive spotted coat. But the forest remained silent, holding its secrets close. The kittens, remarkably, seemed unbothered. They nursed from bottles Elias prepared, tumbled over each other in play, and slept in a pile that reminded him of the yin-yang symbol Clara used to draw: perfect balance, perfect peace. 3 days later, Sierra returned. She stayed only a moment, licking each kitten's head as if giving final instructions. Elias was splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard Pumpkin's distinctive yowl, not alarm, but announcement. He dropped the axe and hurried around to the front, his heart hammering in his chest. There she stood on the porch, looking leaner, more feral than she had in weeks. The domesticity of the cabin had worn off like morning dew. She was wild again, every line of her body speaking of forests and freedom. When she turned and walked away, the three strong kittens followed without hesitations, Scout first, as always, then Whisper and Boulder in a line. Their movements were already sure, their instincts awakening to the call of the wild. Only Hollow remained, his little legs trembling. He looked at Elias, then at his mother, then back at Elias. Sierra turned back and called softly to him, a sound Elias had never heard her make before, something between a chirp and a growl, full of longing and love. Hollow took one halting step forward, then another. His back legs gave out and he sprawled on the wooden floor. He didn't cry, didn't make a sound, but his whole body quivered with effort and frustration. He tried again, fell again. Sierra waited, patient as stone, but Hollow couldn't follow. The distance between them, only 20 feet of forest floor, might as well have been an ocean. Elias stepped forward, gently picking him up. His voice cracked as he spoke. "If you stay," he whispered, voice rough with emotion, "you'll have to learn how to be human. Or at least something close to it, something between wild and tame, something new." Hollow tucked his head into Elias's chest, purring softly in acceptance. The sound vibrated through Elias's ribs, finding the hollow spaces around his heart and filling them with something warm and living. Elias smiled faintly, eyes stinging. "Then so be it. I'll call you Hollow, because you came from the hollow in my heart and you filled it." Sierra watched them for a long moment. Her golden eyes held Elias's gaze, and in that exchange, he felt understood completely. She was entrusting him with her son, acknowledging that Hollow's path would be different from his siblings, that sometimes love meant letting go in ways that hurt. Then she turned and led her 3 kits into the forest, just as she had always belonged to nature from the beginning. Hollow stayed the only bridge between the wild and the tame. From that year on, every spring as wildflowers bloomed, Sierra and her 3 young bobcats returned to visit Elias, Pumpkin, and Hollow. They never stayed long, but they always came. A shadow flickering through the trees, a small figure darting from the brush, that was enough for Elias to know his second family was still out there, and they still knew their way home. Hollow grew, though never to the size of his siblings. His back legs remained weak, giving him an unusual hopping gait that Pumpkin found endlessly fascinating. The old orange tabby would follow Hollow everywhere, mimicking his movements in a clumsy dance that made Elias laugh until his sides ached. Hollow learned to climb using his front legs and claws, to balance on 3 legs when necessary, to accept help without shame. He learned, too, that being different didn't mean being less, a lesson Elias suspected the kitten was teaching him as much as learning himself. The years passed in a rhythm of seasoned springs when Sierra visited with news of grandkittens, summers filled with the buzz of insects and long afternoons on the porch, autumns when Elias would prepare the cabin for winter, and winters when the 3 of them, man, house cat, and Bobcat, would huddle close to the fire and tell each other stories without words. One early spring night, the air turned cold, and wind howled through the window panes. Pumpkin, now old, with dim eyes and dull hearing, had been lying still all day, refusing food and water. Elias sat beside him, worried, Hollow curled up against Pumpkin's back, softly mewing, trying to awaken some familiar reaction. But Pumpkin only breathed shallowly, his eyes open and unmoving. Elias stroked the worn fur, his throat tightening. You remember her laugh, her touch, the way she sang while cooking? You were there when I wasn't strong enough. Please, old friend. Not yet. His voice broke on the words. Pumpkin had been Clara's cat first, her constant companion through years of joy and the final hard months of illness. When she died, Pumpkin had grieved too, refusing to eat for days, sleeping on her side of the bed as if waiting for her return. And now this loyal creature, who had been sentinel and guardian and friend, was fading away. Exactly at midnight, there came a faint scratching at the door. Sierra. No one had called, no signal was sent. She entered quietly, like the breeze, carrying a live field mouse, placing it before Pumpkin, then lying beside him just like during her birthing days. She knew, simply because she was a heartbeat of this place. Hollow curled up at her feet, eyes glistening at his mother, a reunion of sorts. Mother and son keeping vigil together. The 3 of them lay together that night. Elias dozed in his chair, waking periodically to check on Pumpkin, to adjust the blankets, to whisper words of comfort and love. Sierra never moved, her warmth pressed against Pumpkin's failing body, her presence a gift beyond measure. By morning, Pumpkin opened his eyes, rubbed his head against Elias. The old man held him close, saying nothing, tears streaming down his weathered face. Once again, Pumpkin was pulled back from the edge of time, not by medicine or science, but by the quiet love between beings who had no words. Sierra stayed for 3 days that time, longer than any visit before. She slept beside Pumpkin, shared her food with him, groomed his matted fur with gentle licks. Hollow watched his mother with wonder, perhaps remembering some deep instinct from his infancy, perhaps simply recognizing grace when he saw it. When Sierra finally left, Pumpkin was eating again, moving again, present again in the way that mattered. From that day, Elias cleaned the old porch and built a wooden board, the wall of life. On it, he hung small photos, Clara reaching out in her old wool sweater, Pumpkin from chubby kitten to aged sleep, Sierra the first day she entered the cabin, the 4 bobcat kittens, Hollow taking his first steps on twisted legs, Nora with a tearful smile as she looked at the kittens in coats, and the many animals that had visited, birds with broken wings that Elias had nursed, squirrels that had learned to eat from his hand, young deer that wandered close to the cabin seeking the salt lick he maintained. Each photo had a name, a date of arrival and departure when applicable, and a small handwritten note by Elias. Everyone who lived here left behind their love. The wall became a pilgrimage site of sorts. Nora brought friends to see it. Neighbors who had once thought Elias eccentric now understood he was building a monument to connection, to the ways that love transcends species and circumstance and even death itself. That night, after Sierra left again, Elias sat by the fire alone, Hollow and Pumpkin curled up on either side of his chair, their breathing synchronized in sleep. He looked at the wall, at all those faces frozen in time, and felt something settle in his chest, not quite happiness, not quite peace, but something close to both. Acceptance. Perhaps gratitude. Certainly, he drifted into the deepest sleep he'd had in years, in his dream. Clara sat at the old wooden table. Gentle light shone in, and she placed her hand on his shoulder. Her gaze soft, her smile warm like the first spring breeze. You've taken good care of them. Now let them take care of you. He reached for her hand, but she slowly faded into the light. He didn't panic, didn't cry out. Instead, he smiled. Understanding that this wasn't goodbye but transformation, Clara had become part of everything in this cabin. Every act of care, every moment of love. She lived in the wool blankets and the sweaters turned coats, in the wall of photographs and the choice to stay when others fled, in the hollow of his heart that had learned to fill itself again. When Elias awoke, morning had broken. Pumpkin lay at his feet, Hollow curled against his side, letting out little huffs in his dreams. Outside, the wind chimes rang gently, the ones Clara had hung years ago. Their clear notes, a language she'd said only the wind could speak. It was a morning like 100 others, and yet unlike any before. He rose, poured himself tea from the pot that still sat on Clara's favorite shelf, and looked out the window where wildflowers bloomed around the porch. Outside, purple lupine and golden poppies had returned without his planting, Clara's flowers choosing their own time to bloom again, as if the earth itself had decided it was finally time for beauty to return. His heart, once filled with ashes, once hollow and echoing, had sprouted tiny green shoot. Clara was gone, but her legacy of love still lived in the muse of a bobcat kitten, the soft breath of Pumpkin, the unwavering gaze of Hollow, and in the trembling hands of an old man holding a fragile life close to his chest. The cabin was no longer just where he lived alone. It was where life returned. It was home. That's what family does, Nora said softly. The ones we're born to and the ones we choose, they keep us alive when we don't want to keep going. She paused, then added, Grandma Clara would be proud, you know, of all of this. I know, Elias said, and he did. Clara had understood, perhaps before he did, that an open heart was the only path through grief. That love didn't end with death, it transformed, found new channels, flowed in unexpected directions. The Bobcats were evidence of that truth, wild love answering domestic grief, nature stepping in where human connection had been severed. As evening fell, Elias lit the oil lamps and prepared dinner. Hollow had learned to eat from a dish, though he still preferred when Elias hand-fed him small pieces of meat. Pumpkin, ever dignified despite his age, ate slowly from his bowl, pausing occasionally to watch Hollow with what looked like paternal satisfaction. These small rituals, the preparation of food, the settling into evening, the way the light shifted across the walls had become sacred to Elias. Each moment was proof that he had survived, that they all had survived, and that survival could transform into something richer and more complex than mere existence. That night, Elias added a new photograph to the wall of life. It showed him, Hollow, and Pumpkin on the porch, the three of them silhouetted against the sunset. Nora had taken it that afternoon, and when Elias looked at it, he saw something he hadn't seen in years himself, truly present, eyes clear and focused, mouth curved in a genuine smile. Not the hollow-eyed widower who had refused evacuation years ago, but someone who had found purpose again. He wrote beneath it, We are each other's wilderness and each other's home. The Santa Monica Mountains stretched dark beyond the cabin windows, full of secret lives and wild hearts. Somewhere out there, Sierra hunted with her grown kittens, teaching them the old ways, the wild ways. They would return when spring came again. They always did, bringing news of new generations, new struggles, new triumphs. And here in the cabin, the domesticated and the wild that chose tameness would wait, would welcome, would witness. Elias understood now what Clara's folklore book had meant about bobcats bringing both curse and blessing. The curse was the depth of love, the vulnerability of caring for something you could lose. The blessing was the same, the depth of love, the opportunity to care despite the certainty of loss. You couldn't have one without the other. Every act of rescue was also an act of surrender. Every healing a reminder of woundedness. Every beginning shadowed by inevitable ending. But that was life, wasn't it? The whole messy, beautiful, terrifying truth of it. And Elias, who had thought his life was over when Clara died, who had been prepared to fade away in his cabin like smoke dissipating into air, had discovered that life had other plans. Plans that involved wildfire and bobcats and a house cat with an improbable heart. Plans that transformed hollowness into fullness, grief into grace, ending into beginning. He settled into his chair by the fire, Hollow and Pumpkin taking their customary positions. Outside, the wind carried the scent of sage and pine, smoke and flowers. Inside, the cabin held warmth and breath and love, so much love that sometimes Elias felt his chest might burst with it. "Thank you," he whispered into the quiet, not sure who he was thanking: Clara, Sierra, the forest itself, or simply the mysterious force that had brought them all together. "Thank you for teaching me that hollow spaces can be filled, that broken things can heal, that love doesn't end, it only changes shape." Hollow purred in response, and Pumpkin's tail twitched in sleep, and somewhere in the night, a bobcat's cry echoed through the mountains, wild and free and coming home. Every rescue begins with a heartbeat that refuses to give up. We're grateful you chose to listen to this one. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, a simple like or subscribe means the world to us.